Morning, everybody. Um, Welcome back to this pre-recorded lecture. I'm going to pre-record this lecture so that you're able to catch up on it. For many reasons, there are many people that are struggling with data, who are not able to attend Zoom. There are people who drop out when we are on Zoom meetings because of signal issues at home or in residence and in shelter. So for this reason, we've always had a few people attending the lecture. So it's very important to start by saying that and acknowledging that it is a challenge that continues to unfold itself. The fact that data is not arriving at the same time for many of us. It does arrive eventually, but the various service providers are working on it at different times in the month. So for this reason, then we will continue to have these pre-recorded lectures. Those who can attend them, that is great, and those who cannot, I will always post them on other platforms that are accessible so that you can catch up on them when you do receive data eventually. I'll post on Moodle, I'll post on our WhatsApp group as well. All right, so today we are having a guest lecture. I actually thought about a lecture that I had invited Utobani Zigalala to come and do, which is a lecture that looks at Pan-Africanism, decolonization, and the movement to democracy. The reason why I'm bringing it back here is because this lecture is starting a conversation of decolonization of the African continent. We've been talking about new colonialism, colonization, and moving now more towards the fact of decolonization of the African continent. So that is what Tobani Zigalala will talk about. So I will bring him in now. So this is pre-recorded. So please sit back and relax, and hopefully you enjoy the conversation.
Line in.
Decolonization of the African continent. So that let's go there.
Okay, we are officially live on Facebook. Thank you once again, Tobani. I don't even know how to introduce you because you have become a comrade and the student of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where you are doing an honors program in political science. Really amazing, brilliant scholar that is emerging in our midst. We're really, really happy to have you here. To take us through ideas, really. It's a conversation on ideas that I think these ideas have been imagined for quite a number of years, decades, if not centuries, about shaping a Pan-Africanist agenda. for former colonies of the South, not just South Africa, but it's happening, the conversation everywhere. In Latin America, it's happening on the African continent, and so on. So today, I think we are honored to have Comrade Tobani, and I comfortably call you Comrade, but I also know that you are a student of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, because our spaces lie in different ways. So I'm happy to have you, Jessamine. Really thank you for agreeing to be a part of the conversation and leading us through your ideas. I've heard you talk about this in our class. There's something I don't know how to actually name you, because you've said in the class, but I thought at some point in your ideas have been brilliant. And now we sit together in a decoloniality action group of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where we continue to imagine this decolonization. So the conversation is yours today. The space, the floor is all yours. This is shared with the students who are doing political science 204, and the module is focused on politics and the law in South Africa. And the idea really is to say we have as one of the conversations in that lecture that we are looking at Pan-Africanism, colonial independence, and the movement for democratic change in South Africa, to say what has been that conversation. And I think particularly now that we are, living during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're just interested to hear your thoughts. Feel free to take us from wherever you want to take us, and then we'll open the floor. I welcome you, Owetu. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for everyone that is joining us on Facebook. Feel free to comment. We'll make sure that you bring in your ideas through the Facebook medium as well. And for those who are not able to join us here, because of issues of data, we know that we have a problem. We have a problem with data. A lot of people are not accessing data. A lot of our students don't have access to data. And when it comes at different times, and it makes it difficult for all of us to enjoy these wonderful and beautiful conversations. And for that reason, I think I will ask you, Tobani, to also feel free to talk about what it means to have a social pedagogical, way of learning. What does it mean to actually learn as a student during this time? And what would, for instance, people say? So, but over to you. I don't have to preempt what you're going to say. The floor is yours, Tobani.
Of course. First of all, let me greet everyone who's listening from wherever they are listening. Of course, man, you've given a very glorifying and very nice background and introduction to myself. But all in all, to be very honest, I'm just a para. Like, I'm just like that person you see on the street of Durban begging for money. I am not different. It's just that I spend most of my time begging for the acquisition of knowledge. So when I proudly call myself the part of the corridors of knowledge, a scavenger at the liberal, at the dustbin of liberal academia, I am necessarily just that, right? I'm just this guy who is rural born, who was brought up in a township, who has lived most of his adult life now, which is very limited in itself, in the quest for a different type of knowledge, in a quest for a different type of possibility. In almost, I live in two paradigms, right? I live in the present and now, but I live also in ideas. I live in the imagined, right, of a different possibility of the thing we are living today. Because quite frankly, I've been laboring on this point that quite frankly, as black people, as scholars before us have said, we are living a life of sickness. We are consistently sick people. So if we are consistently sick people, we must constantly be people who are seeking remedy to cure ourselves, right? Because we're people, for most of our lives, we have lived a life of oppression. Our oppression now spans over 3 centuries, right? So I want to start for us to start there, that who are we, right? Of course, we have lived most of our lives defined from the position of us, because most of our lives have been lived in the face of oppression and colonial invasion. So what do I mean by this? I mean, for South Africa, for example, when you speak about South Africa today, it seems as if our history begins at 1652 at the colonial encounter with the thieves from Netherlands, led by one Jan van Riebeeck in that company called the Dutch East India Company. It seems as if our history begins. And I know for a fact, and we know many of our people who have at least tried to imagine the possibility of a history before them, that we know for a fact now that our history does not begin in 1652. But of course, the history that has been available to us, that has been told to us by the other, is that our history begins when the state is covered, right? Of course, I think that it is important for us to reflect upon that. What is this idea of ourselves from the position of the other, right? So I wanted to begin there, but I've been at this task to say or speak on three things. One, the history of Pan-Africanism in the continent, in the diaspora, and more specifically in the country called South Africa. That's my first task. My second task is to speak a bit about this thing called colonial independence, which I've decided to say it is the struggle for independence from colonialism. The last point is the idea of the movement for the democratic change. And I think for me, these three themes are reflective in the weaving intellectual and theoretical I'm going to be doing now. So let us begin. The idea of a Pan-Africanist, oh, my comrade is here. Sorry, but I see Madam Buyisa here, one of the most advanced young intellectuals I've ever come across. But I wanted to say our history of Pan-Africanism begins even before we know the idea or the name Pan-Africanism. Our idea of Pan-Africanism begins at the quest of Africa to redefine herself when it has been invaded by thieves, rapists, and plunderers of the continent. For South Africa, this idea begins as the first colonial encounter of the people of the Khoi and the San in the banks of the seas of the so-called Cape of Good Hope, now known as Cape Town. It is the battle of Auchua and the thieves of Jan van Riebeeck. It is as first as that idea that the idea for Africa's independence and the stopping of the plundering of Africa's resources began. So that's specifically for South Africa. And of course, if you speak about the rest of the continent, you speak about the slave catching and the fight against stopping the idea of taking slaves from the banks of Benin and the banks of Tanzania, the banks of the west coast of Africa going into the now known United States of Africa, which is for me the capital of imperialism and capitalism as we know it today. So the idea of us and Pan-Africanism does not begin at us naming this thought process or this activism as Pan-Africanism. It begins first on the ground fighting to defend our lands, right? As Achua led his Khoi and San people 8 years after the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck in the banks of Cape Town. And of course, for those who have followed the Pan-Africanist tradition, people will know that Pan-Africanism can be said to have its origins in the struggles of the African people against enslavement and colonization. This is the thought process of one Dr. Tajdun Abdul Rahim of Pan-Africanism politics and economy and social change in the 21st century. This struggle may be traced back to the first resistance of slave ships, rebellions and suicide, through the constant plantation, colonial uprisings, and the back up to Africa movement of the 19th century. Of course, as I said, that our first idea of this Pan-Africanism is at the encounter with the colonizers. For South Africa, I said, it is 8 years after the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. There at the banks of the Cape of Good Hope seas, where Achua led his people to defend the lands of the African people. Also, it is at the banks of the Benin seas where we fought defending our people. Of course, this idea of Pan-Africanism then is said that it its origins are here at the fighting of defending Africa and her people from enslavement and colonization. Of course, one must say that Pan-Africanism then emerges as a distinct political movement, initially formed and led by the people from the diaspora. And this has been the contestation of many so-called Africans, that the Pan-Africanist movement seems to have its theoretical roots and intellectual roots in the diaspora. It seems as if the diaspora is trying to tell us what's good for Africa. Of course, the sons of Africa who were stolen from Africa and turned into slaves in America, the Caribbean, and the whole of the Americas have almost a back right to be able to tell us, because they are the first people maybe who in all themselves have been able, have lost what is Africa. So they are quest to regain themselves, because first and foremost we must speak about this, that Africa does not only lose his land, but Africa loses her being, and Africa losing her being and his children and her body also loses the idea of her spirituality, the idea of her knowledge, even the birthright of being able to name and give meaning to things. So when these Africans who find themselves in the diaspora begin to think about what it is to be African, and of course begin with the idea of the movement of the Back to Africa movement. The other idea that we must speak about is that, for example, W.B. Du Bois, who convened the first Pan-African Congress in 1919 in Paris, France, with the conference demanding independence for African nations. Further congresses, of course, were held. The most notable congress of Pan-Africanism is, I think my comrade Manda will agree with me, is that 1945 conference in Manchester, London, which was convened by our brother, our father, and our theoretical ancestor, George Petty. This conference becomes very important because for the first time, a large number of Africans from the continent were present at the meeting, providing impetus and momentum for the numerous post-war independence movements. So, but it is theoretically maybe incorrect for me to speak of that conference, having not spoken about, I think for me, the greatest organizer of Black people. I don't think any other person has organized the African people in the diaspora and in the diaspora and in the continent itself better than one Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was of Jamaican origin in the Caribbean, of course finding herself in the enslavement imperialist capital of America. So for me, one may see that I'm jumping from here to there. It is because the idea of Pan-Africanism, I don't think for it has a linear, what you call a process of development. It develops from there to there, but of course always finding connections to each other. So I said, for me, the most notable conference is the 1945 conference of which Balaji was led by one George Petty. This is the conference where the likes of Kwame Nkrumah and many other leaders of Africa, including your Jomo Kenyatta, attended. This conference comes post the war, the Second World War, and it has inspired many of the so-called independence from colonialism. One of those movements being the movement led by one Kwame Nkrumah in the then the Gold Coast today named Ghana. This movement of Kwame Nkrumah, who begins to become the lodestar, the father of the continental Pan-Africanism, when the diaspora almost lost its leadership of the Pan-Africanist movement, it was Kwame Nkrumah who emerges as the father of Pan-Africanism. Now, Kwame Nkrumah's movement wins independence and becomes the first African country to win independence from the colonizers in 1957. Now, the independence of Ghana is important because it is at the independence of Ghana that one Kwame Nkrumah stands and speaks of the idea that the independence of Ghana is almost invalid, almost meaningless, if it does not come and inspire the independence of the whole of Africa and their people living in the diaspora. Now, this important assertion by Kwame Nkrumah tells us the basic tenets of what Pan-Africanism about. The idea of unity and solidarity of the African people for Africa and their people's freedom from colonizers, and the ability for Africa to be able to name herself, to direct her own affairs, and to be able to lead her own people. This, for me, is one of the most basic tenets of Pan-Africanism. Of course, it becomes the idea of self-reliance. Now, of course, in the continent, it will be very unfair of me to speak of Pan-Africanism and not speak of only Kwame Nkrumah, and not speak of Jomo Kenyatta, and not speak of Sekou Touré in Guinea, and not speak of Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, and speak of one Frans Omar Fanon, right? And speak of one Patrice Lumumba, speak of one Thomas Sankara in the then what is it called, this country, which is now called Burkina Faso, right? The land of upright men. It is very then, for me, unfair to speak of Pan-Africanism and not speak of one Julius Nyerere. But I want to speak of one Haile Selassie. Now, these are the leaders from their different countries who, post the Manchester Conference I spoke about, started to convene conferences in Africa, most of them led, of course, by Kwame Nkrumah, the All Africa's People's Convention, convened by one Kwame Nkrumah. Now, these conferences, amongst other things, was to chief up amongst it was the speaking of an idea of a united Africa. Now, this conference brought together independent states of Africa, the first one bringing about 8 countries. Of course, it is developed, the second one, up to a point where it was able to host about 31 countries, right? So, of course, I think I lost connection. Am I still audible? Hello?
No, we can hear you. We can hear you, Tabani.
You are still on, bro.
I'm still on. Sorry. I thought I lost connection. So I'm saying the All Africa People's Convention started to speak about the idea of an independent, of a united Africa. Now, these All Africa People's Conventions brought about at first the then independent states of Africa, together with the liberation movements of Africa. Of course, in the first one, Frans Omar Fanon was there as a delegate of the FLN of Algeria. And at this time, Algeria was not free from France, but was beginning to make inroads towards independence. In the conference preceding maybe what people will call one of the most important conferences ever held in Africa, was the conference of which led to one of the conferences that led to the conversation around the forming of the OAU, Organization of African Unity. Now, I speak of the continent first because I want to really, as we come to a close, to zone in on the developments in Africa. Now, at this time, when Kwame Nkrumah's government movement has won independence in Ghana and has inspired independence in many other countries, including your Guineas and your Libya, the conversation about the United States of Africa begins. Kwame Nkrumah's group, which many call the Casablanca group, if I'm not being ahistorical here, making a mistake, but the Casablanca group makes an assertion, and their argument is that Africa will need to immediately form itself out of the independent state into a united government of Africa. This is the argument of the so-called Casablanca group, which included countries like Algeria, Egypt, Ghana, Tanzania, Guinea, Libya, Mali, and Morocco. This group met in Casablanca in the early 60s, and their vision was simple, that Africa must begin to unite so that it is able to assert its independence in the world and continue and be able to help its people prosper. On the other side was a group called the Monrovia. Now, the Monrovia group argued that the immediate unification of Africa will not work. What we'll need to do is a gradual unification of Africa. Of course, the Monrovia group seems that they won the debate, and I think young scholars of today will need to go back and revisit those arguments. That isn't it that at the time Kwame Nkrumah's group was correct? Africa needed to immediately unite at the point of colonial independence and not wait for years to go by until it unites. Of course, the gradual unification led to the Organization of African Unity, which in 2002 became the African Union. Now, on the other side of the Casablanca group, the argument was very simple. Do not let these African leaders to enjoy the idea of statesmanhood for so long until you unite Africa, because in that way, they would have enjoyed being president and prime minister so long that they will not want to be part of one government. And I think this is what has been true for Africa. Because we took so much time in uniting ourselves, we have in almost, delayed the independence, the unification of Africa. So what I'm saying is that we need to go back to this idea of revisiting the arguments made by our forefathers at that time. But maybe let me leave that there and go straight into understanding the development of the Pan-Africanist tradition and movement in South Africa now, which some of us, of course, because of our ideological affinity, correctly call occupied Azania. And I'm going to make a description of why some of us lean towards the idea of occupied Azania or Azania and Africa as, when we speak of post-1994 South Africa, we don't say post-apartheid South Africa. We speak of a post-1994 moment South Africa, because for some of us, 94 really changed nothing. So in South Africa, as the developments in the world are happening, very deep developments are also happening concurrently in Africa. As I said, developments around Pan-Africanism were happening in all different parts where Africa's people found themselves, but in those different developments, they were all also interconnected into the development of Pan-Africanism. So in South Africa, of course, the organizing around ideas of defending Africa for some of us will begin, even when you look at our kings, right? Some of us will go even as far as King Shaga's idea of unifying all black tribes or nations in South Africa was a Pan-Africanist idea. But that's an argument for another day. At the last battle fought by our traditional chiefs is the battle of the Bambata rebellion led by one Inkosi Bambata Kamangida of the Zondi. Post that, we organize ourselves politically in terms of organizations, and first, we found an organization called the South African Native National Congress. Now, I'm in no way calling the South African Native National Congress a Pan-Africanist organization. I'm merely mentioning it as part of the organic procession of Azania's people in their ideas around organizing and what they are organizing for. In 1913 or in 1910, the Union of South Africa is founded. 2 years later, we found the South African Native National Congress. A year later, one Soliplati says the native woke up as a pariah in the land of his forefathers. Because on that year, the colonial invaders have taken everything from us. First, we lost the land through battles and wars. And in 1913, the Union of South Africa made into law the Native Land Act to prohibit us as African people or native people of the African continent from owning any land above 13% of the total land mass of South Africa. Now, this is important because Many people will want to speak about Pan-Africanism and not speak concretely about the land question and the dispossession of the Africans. Everywhere in the world, everywhere in the continent where we have battled, the idea has always been about the independence of Africa and the repossession of the land of Africa's people. Even in South Africa, our organizing has always been about, and even our rebellion has always been about returning Africa's land to Africa's people. So as we organize the South African Native National Congress, which later in the 1980s, of course, changes to what we know today as the African National Congress, we are organizing to fight for our independence. Now, I will not, like many other people, differentiate what independence means, what freedom means. I know some people speak of political independence, economic independence, social independence, and all the like. I speak of independence in one because you can't compatibilize your independence or your freedom. Your freedom is, you can't be a half slave. You are either free or not free. It is clear as that. You can't be two things, right? I know some people want to speak about an idea of political independence. But what does political independence mean when you don't have control of your resources of a country, where wealth accumulation is made, which of course gives you power as a nation to be able to dictate, and sovereignty to be able to dictate upon the world who you are, right? And I think this is important for me to clarify that this idea where we want to cut off, people speak of epistemic independence, political independence, pedagogical independence, economic independence. For me, it is one. It's a political project that encompasses independence in the main, because we do not only lose our land, we do not only use our right to self-governing, but we also lose our idea of naming, our idea of what knowledge is, and many of it. But I digress. Let me complete my process here so that I can allow questions. I'm saying in the 1930s, we then changed the South African Native Congress to the African National Congress. Now, this period is very important for me because this is the same as African Renaissance Project, which gave birth to the African National Congress. It's critical now because at this point, leading to the 40s, a young man in South Africa will emerge. And for me, this is to young people and about thinking about our country. At this point, a young man in South Africa emerges. His name is Mzwakhe Anton Lembede, and his comrades, who at the time are called by some people young Tex, right? They form what at the time was known as the Congress Youth League, because the African National Congress did not allow people of a younger age to join them, the same way it did not allow women to join them. So they form what is known as the Congress Youth League, and they apply for membership of the African National Congress. This group is led by Mzwakhe Anton Lembede. They pronounce themselves, note this, ideologically as African nationalists. This is the first radical strand of development for the Pan-Africanist agenda in South Africa. Of course, we have got your development from African Renaissance, which we cannot, of course, ignore. But at this point, in 1944, when the African Congress Youth League is founded, they are clear ideologically who they are. They are African nationalists. In 1949, they draw up a program called the Program of Action. Now, also note this program because this program is important, right? 1949 Program of Action, which they then lobby the African National Congress to adopt as a program. This program guided by African nationalism and the adage that says Africa for Africans. This is another basic tenet of the Pan-Africanist movement. The Pan-Africanist movement has always believed that Africa belongs to the African people. Now, Anton Mzwakhe Lembede leads this conflict. Of course, he dies a few years later, but ideologically, he is the lodestar of the African nationalist project post-1944 in South Africa. Of course, he's with comrades like A.P. Mda, he's with comrades like your Robert Sobukwe, your Peter Raburuko, and many. Now, I've heard some people speak of and this is going to be a bit maybe controversial. I've heard some people speak of a history of Pan-Africanism in Africa, in the globe, and in the continent, in the occupied Tanzania, which is called South Africa today, and omit the name of, I think, second to Anton Lembede, of the most important leader of the Pan-Africanist agenda in South Africa. This is one Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. Mangaliso Sobukwe, in post-1955, when the ANC adopted the Cape Town Charter, famously known as the Freedom Charter, Mangaliso Sobukwe leads a comrade who called themselves the Africanists. Now, this Africanist bloc argues relentlessly. Now, this is another thing we must learn from those who came before. They did not just amend about issues. They argued intellectually. They organized themselves with ideas. Robert Sobukwe, in 1957, goes to an ANC conference to argue. He's been arguing for 2 years post 1955. But in this conference, it's very important because in this conference, he argues. And of course, at the time, those who ran the ANC, who were more sympathetic to the Freedom Charter and in the alliances that have been built with South African Indian Congress, the Communist Party, and many others, were very much hostile to this idea of the fact that Robert Sobukwe argued that the Freedom Charter is a sellout document because the Freedom Charter says South Africa belongs to everyone who lives in it, both black and white. The Africanist, which we later know as the Pan-Africanist, argued that this first preamble in itself, before you read the whole document, is a sellout clause because it then argues that South Africa now belongs to everyone. And by some people have said, the idea that you say a thing belongs to everyone, you are equally just saying it belongs to no one. And for me, I think some people must stay on that thought and maybe reflect on it later. That when Mangaliso Sobukwe says the 1955 Freedom Charter is a betrayal of the 1949 Program of Action, which has declared Africa for Africans, and suddenly the Freedom Charter changes and declares South Africa belonging to everyone. And I think these two documents must be, of course, interrogated. But Mangaliso Sobukwe, having argued relentlessly, of course, around having argued for against, sorry for that, Mangaliso Sobukwe having argued against the Freedom Charter. And seemingly that he saw that he had lost because even the movement had become so hostile against him. Some people will say Mangaliso Sobukwe was chased away from that conference with his comrades. There's this time that he decides that there is no hope for him inside the African National Congress. And they start to charge their way outside of the ANC and declare themselves out of the ANC. And they form what we know today as the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Now, this is the organizational formation of the Pan-Africanist tradition in South Africa. Now, note this. Intellectually, the Pan-Africanist agenda had been developing in South Africa. And of course, at this point in 1959, the representation of this idea becomes Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. But in 1959, in Soweto, in Orlando Communal Hall, Pan-Africanism gains its organizational presence in the South African country. Of course, this is concurrent with the movement for colonial independence, movement for the independence of South Africa, movements against apartheid, movement for democratic change in South Africa. The idea, because Robert Sobukwe says the Pan-Africanist Congress is fighting for an African socialist democracy, where the African majority will be able to dictate, the African majority will be able to dictate itself in the land of its birth. Now, 1959, as I said, 6 April is a very important date. Now, note the 6 April. I don't know if these comrades chose this 6 April deliberately, but this 6 April is the very same 6 April in 1662 that Jan van Riebeeck arrived on. It is the same 6 April 1959 where in Orlando Communal the Pan-African Congress finds itself. Of course, years go by. Robert Mamososogbu in 1960 inspires what we know today because of the post-1994 South Africa we live in as Human Rights Day, which is correctly Sharpeville Day, right? 1960, 21 March, Robert Sobukwe were protesting the idea that the African person must, in his land of his own, walk around with a document that identifies who he is, when colonial invaders and their children do not carry the same. At this time, Mangaliso Sobukwe organizes for the African people to be able to assert themselves and assert their humanity and their beingness without needing the validity of a document of invaders. I don't know, I think I've taken so much time. I will just say at this point that for me, this is the reflection upon which the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Pan-Africanist movement finds itself, first, as I said, in the diaspora as it begins, finds itself in the continent, and finds itself in our country, South Africa today. And all of this for African people has always been about fighting, one, to instill a democracy in South Africa, but first and foremost, to regain Africa from the clutches of colonialism, to regain Africa from the clutches of invaders, to regain Africa from the clutches of foreigners in our own country. I think for us, that's where we must, as I close, I will finish here because of time. I will have continued to say, right out of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe emerges a new strand of political theory, political thinking, led by one Steve Batu Bonkedi. But I will end here in 1959, of course, for the sake of the presentation. But I will hope that questions that will come will allow us to reflect from 1959 up to 1954, and maybe reflect that what has changed, what are the results, what made the Pan-Africanist movement in South Africa be almost so much disorganized, to be able to say what is this thing today, what is Pan-Africanism today in South Africa? I think our questions maybe will allow us to boil it there. But Dr. Telavilagas, I thank you for the opportunity. I don't want to waste much more time. I think I've rambled for the past 30 minutes or 40 minutes if I'm not
thank you so much. I mean, this conversation, for me, we can have it for the whole night because it's a very, very interesting conversation. But I also, like you, I want to respect the time Yaman who have joined us. And the reason I'm saying that I think is because we also do need to talk about what would Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe say during the moment of COVID-19. You know, what would Steve say during the moment of COVID-19? So I think we do need to come closer to those years that you are saying. But I suppose with the question and the conversations that will emerge. So I just want to bring in maybe, you know, people from the floor. You've had Tobani taking us through that history of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. So it's very interesting that you are saying, Tobani, ANC for the, you know, the African Natives Congress was never a non-Pan-Africanist organization. From the onset, it was very clear. The politics of liberation in the country, you know, the struggle for liberation has always been about the fact that we are Pan-Africanists, you know, we're pursuing a Pan-Africanist agenda. So something happened there. And something that we need to talk about to say, so what happened, you know, where did we go wrong? But I want to open up if there are any questions or comments. This is an open conversation. There are no right and wrong answers. We are reflecting on the state of the nation because we are talking through this module, which is Political Science 204, that says that we need to talk about politics and the law in South Africa. What are the issues? Where do we come from? And how do we fix all of this? So I don't know if there are any thoughts and reflections from the floor. I welcome to share your thoughts as well. Open. Please feel free, Kuluma Nangasi. All the languages are welcome.
Of course.
I am going to at the moment in terms of questions. I think when Nagazigalala, but they give us a valid about. I just want to ask a question. Maybe take us through a little bit up to come speak. Opinion and Julie, I see is raising a hand. Please come through, come please.
Thanks, Comrade Comrade Tobani, thank you so much, brother, for that beautiful, beautiful presentation. I just have one question for you regarding this Africa Free Trade Area. What are your thoughts on it, and what opportunities do you think it has for a renewal of Pan-Africanism in the continent? Thank you.
It's a very difficult question because I think many of us are approaching it with very much emotion because we so want a united Africa. So every time someone says these things, we jump at it. So first of all, let me greet my brother Wandile Buzen Kabika Sinde. We call him Ushelezwe. He's from the University of Cape Town, a PhD candidate there. I believe that he's finished. I see also my other comrade here, Nonkulego Zond, another PhD candidate. I'm listened to by serious people. Serious people are coming here to listen to this para of me. Okay, let me respond to the question much directly. The issue of the African Free Trade Area, we must approach it very carefully, right? There is a paper that my comrade Adilem Tutsama I believe is working on, where he makes a distinction between the Pan-Africanism of Nkrumah and the Pan-Africanism of Rhodes. It is a discussion we can have with him because he's developing a very much critical reflection of this idea of integration of Africa that is developing. But my view is very simple. I ask myself of questions like this. So if we are saying there's an Africa Free Trade Area, whose goods are moving? Right? Whose economy is integrating? I don't see any African economy in Africa. If they are very few. So if we are saying we are integrating economies and we are making it easier to move goods and resources in the continent, the question I want to ask, whose goods? We know South Africa, 97% of the companies, the JSE, are owned by the colonial invaders, white people. So if we are saying we're integrating the continent, who are we helping move their goods much more easily, right? So because we know shop prices everywhere in Africa, we know your Pick n Pays go hand in hand with the political, social, and cultural independence of Africa from the clutches of colonialism, right? So that when we move goods, we are not moving people's goods. We are not moving ourselves. The idea of free trade is
Sincere apologies there. There was a breakdown because of data. So I'm going to find the video again. All right, I'm going to bring Tobani again just to start on the question of the Africa Free Trade Area. Apologies for the break in transmission there.
Right? Whose economy is integrating? I don't see any African economy in South Africa, in Africa. If they are very few. So if we are saying we are integrating economies and we are making it easier to move goods and resources in the continent, the question I want to ask, whose goods? We know South Africa, 97% of the companies in the JSE are owned by the colonial invaders, white people. So if we are saying we are integrating the continent, who are we helping move their goods much more easily? Right? So because we know ShopRite is everywhere in Africa, we know your Pick and Pays are trying to move in Africa, Standard Bank, Nedbank, and all these people. So if we are saying we are integrating Africa without, because the Africa Free Trade Area movement or agreement must go hand in hand with the political, social, and cultural independence of Africa from the clutches of colonialism, right? So that when we move goods, we are not moving people's goods. We are not moving ourselves also. Because the idea of free trade area also means that it will be easier for people to move within the continent. So the fluidity of the labor class in Africa, who does it benefit when it means a person from Mozambique can quickly move to South Africa and all that? So I'm leaning much more towards an argument made by Anderson. We may be here clearly helping people who no longer need the border. We remember who brought the border. We remember who made it difficult for us to move in the continent. Why is it now that this idea of the free trade area is being promoted? So maybe I may not be responding directly to the question, but I have much more questions that all of us who are excited about the Africa Free Trade Area agreement must reflect upon. Whose economy is integrated? Whose goods? Who is the labor force? What of our social, economic, and political independence and integration? Why is no one speaking about that? What is our reflection on the African Union and our trade agreements in Africa? What is the idea of the economic unity of Africa to promote inter-Africa trade? If we don't have that in place, if our free trade does not go with the dreams of the Casablanca group led by Kwame Nkrumah, if our dreams do not go with the dreams of Julius Nyerere, of Mangaliso Sobu, if we are merely interested in just moving goods and not interested in an integrated Africa able to help itself and each other for its independence and its strength, then of course we are merely just helping the colonial invaders continue to plunder our resources. So for me, that's a reflection. I don't know, Manduli, if I answer to you, but I think for me, that's the reflection I would give.
Thank you so much, Tobani, for saying that, because actually this debate is very right now in West Africa. I don't know if everyone is aware that West Africa has been contemplating a united currency. a currency that is moving, the ECOWAS, it's called ECOWAS, the economic zone of West Africans, into a place where they want to have a currency that is called EFO, comparatively to the franc, which has been, of course, a currency that has been used by colonizers. And there's war going on there within ECOWAS, which represents exactly the sentiments that you are talking about and what Philip is asking. To say, if we are talking about free trade, who benefits from free trade? And the Francophone colonizers are fighting back so that ECOWAS does not continue to have a currency that speaks to, West Africans as Africans. And I think it's a question of saying, if we're talking about a kind of independence, that does not vary the fact that resources have got to shift with that independence. So when we're talking about free trade is not just about the movement of money and the movement of labor. It's about who needs to get actually that money and who does the labor. And these are the questions you raised in today. Sounds like the conversations around free trade at the moment are more about opening markets to continue deepening the exploitation of the bodies that have always been exploited in the first place without talking about the shifting of the economic power. Right? So it's going to be a very, very interesting paper that you're talking about. I'd like to read it when the newsroom has produced that analysis, because that analysis is very important where we are in terms of COVID-19. There are lots of conversations now during COVID-19 that are saying, in terms of the economy, we need the margin, bodies that have been marginalized, to take the center, which means that you are taking the economy, and not that you're taking an economy that you have not created. The economy has always been carried by the labor of the colonized. It's about recognizing the power of the labor, that to say, in the very first place, you are the creator and the producer of the economy. And if you're talking about true independence and Pan-Africanism, we're talking about the fact that that shift has got to occur. And whether it happens voluntarily or not is another story. But I just wanted to reflect on that as an example of ECOWAS. Somebody on the chat room, Tobani, has a question for you. Amanda, you sent me this question privately. I don't know if you want me to read it to Tobani publicly. I'm just checking before I read it. So give me a signal, because I'm about to read it. If you can just say yes there on the chat room or no. But one, Amanda is still reflecting on that question. There is an issue that when we talk about the history of Pan-Africanization, okay, Amanda says yes. Let me ask this question as Amanda says before I bring this up. Manda Mabuyisa is saying, I think one must ask Uzigalala if he accepts the constitution or not in the context of this conversation. If it doesn't, does it mean that he always rejects the recent amendments concerning race, for instance? I think there's a number of amendments that have happened during COVID-19 around harsher sentencing of survivors of gender-based violence. The perpetrators are not going to be able to get bail easy. So there's a number of things. The Domestic Violence Act has also been amended to include other categories of rape that were not included before. So anyway, so he's talking about those amendments to say, do you accept the Constitution as Galala, or if you don't, if you reject it, are you also then rejecting the amendments that have happened currently? Which then assures that there is no time frame limit set for one woman to open a rape case. So do you reject this amendment? I think that's the question. You are muted.
It's a very difficult question. And I know why Umanda is raising the issue of rape and whatnot. Because now it provides a, what is it called? But it provides a paradox for me, right? Because on one hand, and I think Manda knows it, on one hand, I believe South Africa is a very anti-black constitution. I believe this vehemently, and I believe this with all my heart. That the Constitution of Africa, South Africa, is a constitution that assures rights to a people who don't have rights, whose humanity has not been recognized as humane. So you are necessarily affirming the right of those who always had rights already. So let's make an example. If you are saying free trial, right, to a person from Alexander who is fighting in a trial with someone from Texas, the idea of what they can afford in terms of law, which lawyers, when someone brings the lawyers from Weber Wenson, which is one of the big 5 companies in South Africa in terms of law, and I bring a lawyer from Legal Aid, who's maybe not paid very well, and is taking any case that's available. What does it mean? Right? The idea of affordability of law, because there are rights that are affirmed by the Constitution, which may be inaccessible for some people. But let's reflect on the amendments. Now, this is my approach when it comes to law. Right? I believe the court of law is hostile to me, it's against me. I will never get a free trial, because even in my entering of the space, my beingness is very already in question. Right? That's the first thing. But can I use the law against itself to help myself and my people move forward a little bit? So, for example, let me put this first. The law of South Africa does not make it illegal for me to organize a protest, right? Though the Constitution is bad, but there are sections within it that I can use to advance myself a bit better. So I agree with some of the amendments that have been made. Of course, the issue of rape is a very deeply painful, deeply critical issue in this country that needs to be dealt with fast and pointy and much more sharply. But on the other side, we have a society, because, and maybe this is what I find a bit controversial for some people, I may get cancelled maybe, but then I'm going to say, we have a society founded on violence, which makes violence almost accepted, right? This is the society we find ourselves in. It's founded on violence, it is maintained by violence, it perpetuates itself by violence, right? For example, the rape of a white woman and the rape of a black woman historically has always not been dealt the same way. If a white woman gets raped today in South Africa, majority of the time the perpetrator is going to be convicted, because the violation of the white bird has always been a crime, right? Even historically, even in consensual relationships, right? Even in consensual relationships where black men and black women have sex, it has always been believed that the man may have done something to the woman to corrupt her to have sex with her. Now, in the post-1994 South Africa, we find ourselves in a conundrum where the law almost makes the rape of everyone illegal, but has not dealt with the narratives, right? The consciousness, right? Which made the rape of a black woman almost accepted. Now, we can make all the laws, but we are dealing with a far more deeper problem of a humanities type of thinking, which says, what makes it in a human being, what makes it right for them to rape, right? Because what we should be dealing with here is that people must not even rape in the first place. Because the problem of laws are that they are there to control and maintain. They're not there to end the catastrophes, right? And we need to start having laws that are restorative in some way. Laws that are there, and an operation in South Africa that is there to end the crimes, right? We don't want people to commit the crime and then polish them after. People must stop raping. But how do people stop raping? Do people stop raping because there is an amendment in the Constitution or in the laws? Or the courts are suddenly acting different? Or do people stop rape because conditions in society have been put in such a way that the raping of black women is almost acceptable? Today I tell you that it is almost as the way it is happening, this thing, you can see that these people feel that they have a right to rape black women. You cannot rape a 3-year-old and tell me it's about sexual pleasure. You cannot rape a 6-month-old and tell me it's about pleasure. There's a far more deeper problem, which comes from the problem that I spoke about in the beginning, that the colonized people are a sick people, right? Colonization, oppression is sickening. And if we don't believe this, we're going to have many, much more problems beyond these problems we're having today. Because we have not accepted that the African people, because of their oppression in the diaspora and in the continent, are a sea people. And because they are a sea people, many wrongs are going to happen in their society. They're going to rape each other, they're going to kill each other, they're going to maim each other, they're going to violate each other, because we think it is acceptable to violate the black body. Because we have no right to almost be angry at any other body. The only body that we are allowed to be angry at. Look at how, when a black person dies on the streets, the newspapers can take a picture, right, and put it on TV, and put it on newspapers, and post it on Facebook. How many times have you seen photos of a dead white body? You don't see it, because white life is sacred, but black life is almost just a thing, right? So for me, it's that reflection. More pointedly, I agree to the Constitution of South Africa. I think even its foundations are unstable. Are there good things being said in this Constitution? Yes. Freedom of expression, freedom of that, yes. Even the ideas of the protection of women against rape is good. It's a good development. But I think we can push much more further than that. And we must be willing to push much more further than that. Let me pack it there. I don't know if I answered Manda's question, but I thought maybe I needed to reflect on the other things.
Thank you so much, Tobane. Umanda says that, well, I guess I was just pushing you to talk about the law because you haven't said anything about the law. But I suppose that says then yes, you have answered. I see Unonti. Unonti is joining us from the diaspora. Ukokononti is in Spain as we speak, and she is in this conversation, and she's saying that our laws are colonial. I agree with you, Tobani, and that is the fundamental problem. And she says we need healing. You know, we are a sick people, not because we want to murder each other, not because we want to rape each other, but because of the oppressions of the past. And colonization is one of those oppressions. And until such time that we dig deeper into the root of what colonization has done to us, patriarchy has done to us, you know, imperialism has done to us, then apartheid, and now what democracy is doing to us, like you're saying, the constitution as a social contract of the nation carries the psyche of the nation. But the foundation are never or were never actually meant to even protect the rights of a black people or the former colonized. That's what Tuban is saying. And I think it speaks to what Tunondi is saying, to say the fundamental problem when you're talking about politics and the law in South Africa, it has got nothing to do with the symptoms of what we see, which are appearing themselves as symptoms of hatred amongst one another. Our young women, black bodies are hung on trees, right? Where there's a lot of anger that is sitting or that is expressing itself amongst our black men. The problem is colonization. So why are we such a sick society? So Tuban is saying in the context of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist thought that there is a conversation that is missing here, which is a conversation of the root, which is colonization. That's what I'm hearing you saying. And Unont is saying we need healing. She agrees with you from Spain. She says, I thank you from Spain. You really spoke to my heart. And I can see from Facebook, Dr. Monique Mse from the University of KwaZulu-Natal has joined us. She's watching us. Thank you, Monique, for joining. We can see Ronelle Carolison is also watching. So you are welcome, everybody from Facebook. I know we wanted to close this segment at 7:30. And I'm very passionate about this conversation. So please stop me because I know it's late at night. Just want to check in if Tobani, you're still able to continue. Should we spend the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes just doing the round of reflections, or should we leave it here? I don't want to disrespect people's time. Owe222 is also saying there on the chat room via Zoom, Zigalala, in your opinion, what would be the meaning of Pan-Africanism during this time of COVID-19 that we are faced with? I would like you to focus your response on the South African context. And I agree, and I think if you don't mind, Tabani, like in the next couple of minutes that are left, also take us a little bit towards Nkrumah, towards Ustipi, you know.
I will try. That's a very deep thing.
It's a very deep conversation, I know. We can't finish it in an hour.
Yeah. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to first, before I respond to Tutu, I want to throw a very controversial thought. I think it's controversial, but it's also, I think, the most correct thought to myself. We know we were fought against apartheid, like this thing of we were fighting against apartheid. We fought colonization. We fought invasion. We fought theft of our bodies and our land and our resources. The laws of apartheid, of Union of South Africa, came later to legitimize what has already been happening. So before there were laws, we were already fighting for our independence.
I have to say something. I can't keep quiet. No, teachers, we fought colonizers, we understand, but nobody teaches us this. You know, it makes us feel like we just started fighting yesterday, that our ancestors were just sitting under the trees and doing nothing. Because we need to learn that we did fight and how we fought. You know, they were in the front line of fighting colonization all over Africa.
Thank you. Let me finish this story. So I wanted to say that point that there is this idea that we have that we were fighting Union of South Africa. We were fighting 1913 Land Act. We were fighting before they made the laws. You know, the genius of our colonial invaders, because we must acknowledge their genius. The genius of these people is that they took everything first. They formed the psyche, consciousness in this society. Then they formed laws later to legitimize all their thoughts and all their plunder and theft. So in 1913, they were not taking land. They were legitimizing the fact that they had expropriated our land without compensation, through murder, through rape, and through maiming of us. So the apartheid agenda that we speak about the system was there to legitimize things that have already been happening, right? So I wanted to say that because I think it's much more important. But let me respond directly to what Tutu is saying. So Tutu is saying, what will Pan-Africanism mean today? First of all, Pan-Africanism will mean that if we are faced with this crisis, we look into ourselves and our knowledge system as a people and say, what of ourselves can solve this crisis, right? So for example, when we are met with COVID-19 or this novel virus, as some people call it, we say, what can our healers tell us? What can our knowledge people tell us? What can our professors tell us? Our own, right? We are saying, before we look into what the world is saying, bathina ogobela bethu, zithini izinyanga zethu, bathina abalaphi bethu besintu bakwaZulu, bakwaXhosa, bakwaSuthu, basebaswithini, bakwavela, bathini, and what is the knowledge that they bring forth that can help us fight this, right? What does African spirituality say about this? How can we organize ourselves much more differently? Because let me say this, the organizing of the African society, in South Africa in particular, has always been centered around the person, not systems, the persons, right? So at the center of our response in South Africa today, the person, the thing at the center should be the person. A people-centric response to the crisis. But the problem we have is that we have a systems-based, economic-based response to a thing that affects the livelihoods of people. So for example, we need to first ascertain, how do we protect the livelihoods of people? You don't give 315 rand to the unemployed and reject so many people who don't have money. You give 2,000 rand and you give our people money to be able to survive because they were sitting at home without livelihood. Right? You protect the incomes of people and you make sure that our people are safe. You give our people medicines where they are. You ascertain from our traditional medicines what of the traditional medicines can help us. You give to our people. You give our people food, right? You give our people something that will say we can respect these lockdown rules because the lockdown respects us. I don't know if this, because you cannot say to me, I must stay at home, but you starve me. Where must I find food? So you give people food, you give people money to take care of themselves, you give people access to medicines, and you then, from there, start rebuilding the economy in such a way that when the crisis comes tomorrow, it will find us in post the COVID-19 crisis. We must not have unemployed people. This we know. There must be no unemployed people. So we must already be starting to think about what industries can emerge. What is the idea of work post the COVID-19 crisis? Do we still continue to organize work in South Africa where we need to go to a workplace? Can we organize work in such a way that I can work at home, right? And still be able to participate in the rebuilding of the economy? Can we organize the economy in such a way the majority of the people benefit from it in terms of ownership? What of the South African Reserve Bank and its duty for social economic development? What about the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank? If the South African Reserve Bank can give 540 billion to 5 commercial banks and give nothing to the people of South Africa, this for me is a crisis. And I think Robert Mangaliso Sobuga will demand of the South African Reserve Bank to be nationalized post this crisis. Will demand that the money of the South African Reserve Bank benefits more the people of South Africa than it benefits the private owners of means of production. I think that's what you will see. But as I end, I will end with a small, if you allow me, 2 minutes reflection on the Lodestar, the teacher, one of the most advanced thinkers of South Africa, Bantu Bongadiwe. Now, Bantu Bongadiwe emerges in the late 1960s, after the burning of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, after the burning of the African National Congress, where the native people, the native and oppressed people of South Africa almost have no organizational leadership inside the country. We had almost surrendered, of course, through the use of the apartheid laws, surrendered our leadership to the white liberals, the good whites who came to love us. Steve Biko finds himself in NUSAS, right? The National Union of South African Students. It is there that it gives us a practical example that the African people and the black people of this country must always lead the struggle of their own independence. He borrows from the tradition of his forefathers. At one time, it is said that when Bantu Bongadiwe came to a room in the 1970s, people go out to go and sleep. I'm saying when Bantu Bongadiwe, it is said that when he came into a room in the 1970s and found Robert Sobukwe in a meeting where he was going to be, he says, "Oh, goes no tipo abadabamnyama uapha." Speaking about Robert, so you understand that this young man is a young man who revered his forebearers. He respected them. Even when he didn't agree with them mainly in some points, but he still respected them. Figo begins his political theory at the age of 23. This is important for some people who go around saying, no, he made a mistake here, he was wrong here. He was young. He was allowed to make mistakes. If he was 40, if he was 50, he was 60 with much more experience in the struggle, we will chastise him for making mistakes. But he was 23. Right? He was 23. He was allowed to make mistakes. But what does Bigo teaches us? Bigo teaches us self-definition. The Black consciousness movement that he founded was clear. First of all, we must regain the right to define for ourselves who we are. Define ourselves according to ourselves. Because the apartheid government has then defined our people as non-Europeans, non-whites. Bigo says we must be able to define for ourselves who we are. That's the first thing. Secondly, he says we must have solidarity amongst all groups which are oppressed. This is why for Bigo, black means the so-called Indian, the so-called African, and the so-called colored. In this instance, I argue with many of my comrades that in this instance, Bigo turns the apartheid category against itself. So the apartheid category had said whites, Indians, colored, Africans, and it said we are different categories. Bigo recognizing with his comrades the strength that we are all those who are called non-Europeans, oppressed by one group, which is white. He puts together with his comrades a philosophy that was there to unite all of the oppressed against the oppressed. This is the genius of Bigo. Bigo moves almost far beyond on the race problematic from the idea of geographic location or biology in terms of where you were born and whatnot. Bigo almost moves away from that and sharply moves to a socio-political definition of what race is. Right? And for me, this is genius because I think this is a far more sufficient definition of what of the race problematic. Of course, the issues of indigeneity, of where you are born and whatnot, play a huge role. But the socio-political, philosophical understanding of the race problematic gives it a description that fits the purpose. Because we're not just fighting that we're born in South Africa. We're also fighting the fact that we're born in South Africa. There is a philosophy that oppresses us. So we must have a philosophy against. There is a consciousness that comes with oppression. We must have a consciousness of liberation. So Bigo gives us a totality of the independence project. And I think Bigo today will say one thing, will remind us that we are an oppressed people, that we must fight for our freedom. He will say today, black men, there's no other person who's your comrade other than yourself. This is what Bigo will say to us. He will say, black men, you are on your own. And he will say, we must make black this country in all its facets. And the black person who's oppressed must always be the person we fight for in country. I think this is what Bigo will say to us. Of course, Bigo, again, his thoughts inspired the greatest youth activist moment of the 1976 June 16. What else can we thank Bigo for? Bigo gave us the total, what you call, reflection of black power in action. Right? When Fanon speaks about the idea of collective violence and all these kind of nice violences, nice things Fanon says about violence, at that moment, the response of our people, their response to
I think we lost you, my brother.
Yeah, I think someone is breaking. It could be signal issues there. It could be signal issues. All right. We'll see, I think, if it comes back. Yeah, but I mean, very, very important reflections there, very, very important key critical thoughts. One of the questions I wanted to bring up, I hope Utobane is able to join us again just to round up on that question, is the role of women in the Pan-Africanist struggle. Because I think in the feminist cycles of thinking and the feminist thought, there's always this question to say, why is it that when we talk about Pan-Africanization, we forget the role of our mothers and our grandmothers in it? We have a number of comrades. I mean, we've got for instance, in Ghana, Asantewa, who was one woman who actually stood up and said, when the men in Ghana did not want to fight the British, she stood up and she said, you know what, if you guys don't want to go to war and fight the British once and for all, I will go and fight. And all kinds of things then happened to her. She ends up in exile and she dies in exile. I think mainly because she's a woman. So I was very much interested to hear Tubani's thoughts around the role of our Pan-Africanist feminists, Pan-Africanist women in the role of, our colonial independence, and not just as Africa, but generally as the former colonized. But I suppose that is going to be a subject of another day. Um, I don't know if there are any last reflections in the last 6 minutes that is left, so that we wrap up at 8. We will come back this series that is looking at politics and the law in South Africa. The next segment, the next seminar, will be looking at the history of South Africa. We're going to look through slavery. What was actually slavery? What has slavery done? And we'll pass through colonization, of course, because that journey moves from slavery right up to colonization to the moments of apartheid and then now democracy. Just to get a historical perspective, to bring in a historical component to these conversations that Toban is talking about, which are focused mainly on Pan-Africanism, colonial independence, and the movement for democratic change in our country. But I think it's important that we locate history in this conversation, to look at, for instance, what bodies, because Toban also spoke about bodies. Say there are certain bodies here that matter, and there are certain bodies that do not matter, and why. But because of time, I think we will leave it there. I suspect that Tubani may be continuing to have problems with the signal, unless there are any comments and questions. But we will come back and speak on the role of Pan-African feminist. Oh, okay, over to you, the last reflections.
Yeah, let me just come and say, I'm coming back to say goodbye. I'm sorry, comrades. I lost my network. I lost the other device I'm using to connect internet to this laptop I'm using. So it's been just a mess. Technology and data poverty and digital device continues to beat us. But what I came to complete on, I think, is the thought that you were speaking about, Dr. Blaga, is the idea of gender-based violence, rape, mob justice, murder, violence in the name. Which bodies matter? Right? Which bodies bring an outcry in this country in such a way that a conviction is certain? Because I have a problem. Yeah, the black body is sucked out of life. Right? There's an idea that we are dead before we are dead already. So when they snitch my throat there in the township, nobody cares. Because then the township is made in such a way that I should not be alive. Because says it is a miracle for a black man to reach the age of 40 in the township. I think it's correct. For those of us who stay in townships and you stay in rural areas, you must check one thing. How many old people do you know around the area you live in? People at the age of 40. How many do you know at the age of 60? We die and no one cares. Because better we are supposed to die. That is their argument. Better we are supposed to die. And for me, I think that is a very critical reflection that we must have of the idea of our non-beingness, right? That we are non-beings in a world where we should be the beings that matter. We are non-beings. It is surprising for us to have life in this world. This is why our achievements surprise people. When we reach 60, people get surprised because the conditions put in place for the African people and the African majority in the diaspora and everywhere is not supposed to make life. When a child from Umlogo to a high school gets 7 A's, we call it black excellence. What is this meaning of black excellence? It means, and I know some of our people celebrate this, youngest black person to get a PhD, only black, for example, my brother, one day, maybe there when he gets his PhD in museum studies, will be the best black person to become a PhD student, graduate in museum studies. We celebrate one day. We are not going to fight against one day and its achievement. But the question we must ask after celebrating him is, why is it that in a country where we are a majority, this is the first person that has started in this thing. When we have more than 80% of this population, when we have a first black billionaire, we must ask ourselves, why is it when we are a majority? This one is the first one, the first actual scientist, the first this, the first that. And we celebrate these things because we live in a liberal society where we have moved away from the ideas of the collective to the ideas of the individual. Let me end with this thought of my other father that I love so much, Kwame Ture. Kwame Ture argues in one of his nice talks, he says, Black people must understand that in any achievement and any progress we make as a race is as a result of our collective struggle and mass mobilization of our people. That we get nothing from this world without struggling for it. That when we sit, it even goes where it said, when we sit at a university class, we must know that this is the product of hundreds, many more of us who lost their lives to fight for us to get to university. And this is a thought that must always be in our Africa's people are nothing without mass mobilization and the collective action. We are nothing. Anything, even the first black billionaires who think today it is just them. It is our collective struggle that makes it possible for a black billionaire to exist. Right? The problem that Africa's people have, and this is another thought from Kwame Ture, is that because we have always been mobilized from outside, white people need to kill one of our own, then we go on the street and we can't breathe. And we are Black Lives Matter because white people have killed us. Because we are now surprised. You know, this is a problem we have. The problem is that, Tina, we are surprised, right? With that, for example, South Africa, this man, Khosa, dies there, killed by the soldiers. We do nothing. Then we see our black brothers and African brothers there in America. George dies there, George Floyd. They go on the street. We get surprised. Oh, God, the Black Lives Matter. Because we have been socialized that our lives do not matter. We kill each other every day. Because we don't think twice when we're, but for me personally, I've been violated by black people. I know the violence of black people, personally and otherwise. So black people don't think twice they're not going to kill you. They don't think twice, they kill you. But because this is not because they hate you personally. It is because they've been socialized in such a way that violence solves all problems. Two, the life of a black person does not matter. So you can kill a black person and you won't go to jail. It does not matter. No one cares about it. So I wanted to end for us with one, organizing. Kwame Ture says we can't mourn any longer. We must organize. We must mobilize for our collective independence. Kwame Ture, for me, at that point, when he speaks about the idea of consciousness and the idea of us carrying a dynamism of our own and mobilizing from within and not from outside is very important. And I think people must go and reflect on this. People can go on YouTube, man, these days. I know some people, books are too much, you know, a book, 500 pages, takes too long. Just go on YouTube, search Kwame Ture, lessons from the 60s. He gives 5 lessons from his activism as a student. This is another very important person. This person started in activism when he was young, he was a student. 5 lessons he gave from the 60s, and one of them is about organizing. Very important. It's about consciousness. And it's about the role of young people, students, who operate. He says very nice things about us. We operate in the space of ideas. Our role is that of agitation, right? But what are we doing? What are we doing? We're doing nothing. We then stand on podiums and chastise those who came before us. When we have not done anything, Tina, to be worth mentioning in one sentence, right? You will go around here, hey, Sobuge was this, Sobuge was this. Go ask yourself, how old was Sobuge when he was doing this? You are 70, you are complaining about a 30-year-old, and you have not done anything, but you are busy complaining. So I think I will end at that and say, Aluta continue. Not yet but we are going to be free. We don't know for certain, but we keep on pushing because the hope in our heart says to us, it will happen. When we don't know, we just give our weekly contributions, and we hope that by the time we depart this earth, we'll have made enough contributions for those who come after us to be able to take the baton and move forward. Because one day, Africa will be free, and Africa will be united. And all his children in the world, all her children in the world, will be able to access in the world, as Nobugo said, an African personality.
Dr. Continua, Siyabonga kakhulu, Tobani. There are people there who are saying, who hope is saying, thanks for this discussion. It's really informative. The importance of organizing movement building, as you are saying, in your beautiful rage, beautiful, calming, decisive rage and analysis there coming out of you, Tobani, that we need to organize. And Komephile says, beautiful mind, my brother, beautiful mind. And there are references that I want to repeat that Tobani touched on. Tobani took us from Marcus Garvey, from the diaspora, to say this conversation started there, right? And at some point you did touch a little bit on Frantz Fanon, but you didn't, stay deeper with Frantz Fanon around his ideas on violence. That's fine, but I'm just pointing it out that there was a point of reference that you made to Frantz Fanon. And I think we'll come back to Fanon in terms of how is he understood in our current political and political systems, because there's a lot of misrepresentation of Fanon. I mean, the argument that Fanon is being taken out of context in the manner that we are understanding violence and the role of violence, and we'll come back to that. And you also, in terms of reference for those who are writing down, Chobani touched on Robert Sobukwe. Robert Sobukwe, please take reference, read Robert Sobukwe. Steve Biko, Chobani spoke about Steve Biko. And now in his closing, Chobani spoke about Kwame Ture. And these references are everywhere. We live in a digital age. We live in the fourth industrial revolution. So Tabana is saying also to us that books, the ideas of books has also changed. We've got e-books, we've got material that is available in various online platforms. You can get it on YouTube, you can get it in really different formats. Let us read deeper, particularly during COVID-19, because COVID-19 has locked us home. COVID-19 said to us, stay at home and be safe at home, although we do not know why they are not organizing our homes. Because Utovana is also saying, how is it that you expect me to stay at home and I don't have food? Because this struggle of Pan-Africanization is about saying that we need food in our stomachs in order to study. We need medicines. I can assure you, Tobani, where we are sitting as a Bokoko, Izangoma, because I also speak as a Sangoma. We are talking about these things and we are hearing voices and rhythms from ancestors and ancestresses guiding this revolution and this organizing that you are talking about. So I think there is imagination that is spiritual. And one of the things that you really write about is the fact that at the center of Pan-Africanist thought is the struggle that is spiritual. It's a spiritual warfare. And it's very, very important that Simamele is Anusi Zetu. Izanusi Zagwan Tobane is saying to us, what is our wisdom, our knowledges? What are they saying? And what are we hearing from that? And I can tell you from the different conversations that I'm in as well during this COVID-19 COVID Tobani is that people are saying COVID-19 is that moment. All these systems of oppression are collapsing. They are collapsing by themselves. It's a revolution that is unstoppable. It is a revolution that you are saying, I made notes as you were talking. It's a social and cultural revolution. It's also an economic revolution, which means that it is rebirthing and resurfacing value systems that were stolen through violence, cultural systems that were stolen through violence, and economic systems, of course, in that sense. So I will stop it there because of time. Tobani says, thank you very much for listening to me, Dr.
I think we have lost it, but what else?
Okay, so
I don't know.
We will stop it there. That is the pre-recorded lecture that I had. Good morning, everyone. I see you have joined in. Today really was a pre-recorded session that is talking about decolonization I invited the guest speaker, Utobani Zigalala. Many of us may know him because he's one of our students who's currently probably has finished his honors degree, if not completing it, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's also a scholar of an action group on decoloniality at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So thank you so much, Tobani. Thank you, Zigalala, for coming in and sharing with us from where you are sitting. So we will continue then on Friday. We will end it here. This was not meant to be an interactive session, but I will, if there are any comments, questions, and so on, we can spend the next 5 minutes or so because I do need to go to another meeting as well. Otherwise, we can hold it here and perhaps talk a little bit more deeper about some of the ideas that Tobani is bringing up. He really touched on a lot of African scholars, has taken way back in terms of where this struggle for decolonization has started and what it is about, not just for the African continent, but for various former colonies of the South. The floor is open. I don't know if you want to say anything, or we will then continue on Friday morning. All right, I don't see any hands. I will see everyone on Friday morning. I know you came in at the middle of the pre-recorded lecture. I will share it as usual on Moodle, on the WhatsApp space, and I'll share it on email as well. A number of people have requested that we also share it by email because you can't access WhatsApp group, neither can you access Moodle because of data issues. So I will send it on email as well. Have a lovely day. We will talk more on Friday. We are wrapping up the segment this coming Friday that talks about decolonization. Next week, we will get into the subject of aid because you are getting closer to preparing for your assignment. And I will give more information around the length of the essay, turn it in details. It is really 3 to 5 pages the most, not more. So that is where we are at, but I will send more details as well before the end of this week about the essay. On Friday morning, definitely, I will tell you some guiding thoughts around the assignment that is due on the 12th of November. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.